There was a little boy who wasn't allowed to watch kung fu movies, and every day he would figure out ways to game the system. For example, volunteering to pick up noodles from down the block and then spending 45 minutes at the noodle stand just watching whatever junk was on TV. And then one day, his cousin handed him a DVD made by Jackie Chan that was teaching little kids, not little kids, but it was teaching young people how to make action movies on their own. And because of that, this, I guess, not so little boy, who was a teenager, started gathering, just finding anybody who could do anything. Kids, somebody who knew how to point a camera, somebody on the cheer squad who knew how to do backflip, that kind of thing, and start making things in their own backyard. And because of that, he met groups of like-minded filmmakers who are all doing things in their backyards with their siblings or buddies. And they moved to San Francisco to make low-budget movies together until finally, I guess he has somewhat of a career, even though it's slightly outside of the orbit of making martial art movies. And ever since that day, he can pay rent without a time card.
I loved looking at your photographs and some of your films, and I'm curious about the journey to get there, to doing what you do now. And maybe you could describe a little bit about what it looks like to live the life that you live now as a photographer director.
Obviously, I wanted to make films and stuff like that for a really long time. And obviously, it was very expensive. I think one thing that we had at my disposal that we could be proud of was like just all these crazy stunt guys that all chose to live on each other's couches in San Francisco for a very, very short amount of time. But what we made looked ugly. You know, we didn't have good professional lighting and we didn't have good professional camera or lenses. And so because of that, you know, it was hard to make a living off of that kind of thing. So I actually I did social work for like 6 years. You know, that was how I paid the bills through my 20s.
You were working with the unhoused in California?
Yeah, like kids from low-income homeless families, immigrant kids. I started out teaching art, but, you know, a lot of those programs were really underfunded. I could speak Chinese. I was male, so that was, I guess, hot commodity in those circles. So I became a youth advocate. You know, I didn't go to grad school or anything for it. They just tried to squeeze in as many credentials as they could and just send me off, and nobody from the city or from the school system questioned anything. I think everyone was just so desperate for that type of, they just needed bodies. So I did that for a while. And then, the big crash happened, stock market crash. So all the funding for nonprofits is San Francisco's nonprofit sectors were just wiped out over a couple of years. But around that time, I was just lucky. I just think digital cameras came a really long way. The still cameras that people were taking beautiful pictures with, suddenly you can shoot kind of high quality-ish videos on those things. And what you were shooting became a little bit closer to the stuff that you had in mind, and you didn't need to spend $60,000, you know, just to rent something for a month. So I think I really thought that, like, if I had access to that or to YouTube, then maybe, you know, life would have been different. But I had to wait a little bit just because the technology wasn't there. So I think in many ways it was just taking advantage of, I guess, emergent technology, what we considered to be emergent technology at the time. I was on movie sets a lot and I had my little camera. So I would just take kind of little behind the scene photos. And it's easy to take good photos of on movie sets because the light and the picture, everyone's beautiful and things are already set up for you. So I was just taking them and putting them on my Facebook. I wasn't claiming them to be anything other than like, hey, these are some shots that I took while I'm on set. But just over time, you know, I've amassed like a couple of thousand images just from doing this almost as a hobby.
Why were you on movie sets so often?
I wouldn't call them movie sets. You know, in San Francisco, we didn't have a lot of movies, So it was a lot of low budget ads and stuff like that. Some of which I was doing, some of which I was helping out on. But yeah, and I think just weirdly through that, I became known as a photographer just through taking pictures on somebody else, other people's sets. And then over time, I think the feedback, the dopamine feedback for, from people, from my peers, I started taking my camera. It was just on me at all times. And I also started developing a little bit of pride in my craft. I had some peers who early on were kind of making fun of how overly manipulated my images were and how, artsy I thought they were. And they didn't mean no harm, but, we're all a little competitive with each other, even if we're close. So I just had my studio mates as little angels and devils on my shoulder every night. So as I was editing images and things like that, I was kind of imagining their mockery or whatever. And it just kind of fueled me to try to get better at this thing. And I think just over time, because of advent of social media and whatever, I was never a big account. I was never a photography influencer, but I just knew enough people who liked what I did to start to pass my name around and to get me, bigger and bigger jobs through this. So it was pretty organic. And I also just think that it helped that as expensive as San Francisco was, I lived above a gun shop with a Japanese landlord who never charged more than $600 for just the crappiest room. And I think it was a lot of things. I think some of it was definitely my drive, but some of it was just I didn't have to pay the same amount of rent as other people. So I could, it didn't take a lot for me to feed myself. So it allowed me to say yes to certain types of jobs and allowed me, I think, a little bit more free time to try things out and to kind of advertise to people the type of stuff that I wanted to do.
What did it feel like to contribute to the Mr. Chu's Chinatown book? The restaurant is a James Beard Award winner, or was the book a James Beard Award winner?
It was really fun. Brandon was, a longtime friend, and I met him the same way, pretty much. I just had a camera on me, and I was following a new friend around who were just walking through downtown San Francisco, and Brandon was cooking in a different kitchen then, and I just had this photo that I took of him, and just through that we became friends, and I remember he just for the longest time he's been trying to get this restaurant kicked off in Chinatown, and I think a lot of I'm not second generation, but the second generation cooks I run into in San Francisco, I think everyone's really excited. Something about somehow doing Chinese food in Chinatown really captured people's imagination. I think a lot of them grew up coming to Chinatown and as almost outsiders, and all of us getting to be there in the middle of it, I think was a really exciting idea. And so as he was putting the restaurant together, he started to ask me to come in for free photos or for trade, and his food was delicious. And I love the scene, and I just love that, if I'm in the neighborhood, there is a place that I could walk into and say hi to friends and stuff, just having another third place to go to. So that was really just the desire, was just, I wanted to be part of an action. I enjoy the fantasy of walking into just the back kitchen and people, they just ignore you. You're there so much, and sometimes they're nice to you because I show up bringing, wings from the neighborhood or whatever. But sometimes they're super slammed and they're just hoping that you get out of, their space. But whatever, either way, I just start hanging out there a lot. And, as glamorous as the place seemed, it's so expensive to start a restaurant in San Francisco. So they were looking for somebody like me, I guess, who would just hang out and show up and take photos of their stuff in exchange for, their Michelin-starred food. So that was how we started. And I remember having to make this choice in 2018 because I had a film. I made a short film that debuted at Sundance, and it was the same month that Brandon signed a book deal for his book. And they asked me if I wanted to be a photographer. And what I didn't realize at the time was that, when you have a short film in Sundance, it's pretty different from getting a short film in other film festivals. Like, that's a launch of a career. I think that's equivalent of going to a good school, which I never did. And suddenly there's this trajectory. LA comes calling, and it was also just, I think, at the height of streamers just investing a lot of money in movies, and everybody was trying to be the next Netflix. But I had to make a choice, and I already promised Brandon that I would hang out. I would stay in San Francisco and I would shoot the book. So that ultimately became like how I spent those couple of years. I thought I could do both, but turned out like the book just required way more, especially that book. Everyone was so thoughtful, everyone on the team. So it just became like way more of a process than a typical cookbook. So I ended up just hanging out in Chinatown. And also it was just a lot. I couldn't handle both trying to get a directing career off ground while handling this much workload. And then also eventually the pandemic happened. So I ended up spending like 2.5 years on that book. But it was really rewarding just because at the beginning of that book, I didn't really know what I was doing. I just shot pretty much. We didn't know what the book was. And I was in the neighborhood so much. So I just started hanging out and I just got acquainted with the aunties and I got acquainted with the shops. And what I didn't realize was like I got to capture the last year of San Francisco and San Francisco Chinatown before, the massive change of COVID, So there are all these shops that just aren't there anymore. There are all these folks who are just not around anymore. So that was a privilege. And that was not a thing that I realized we're signing up to do, obviously. So yeah, that book, it became to mean a lot more. And I think it also just pushed me towards the path of being a photographer when I was at this crossroads. But what is funny is also around that time, just to hang out in Chinatown, I had this movie idea that started brewing, and it took me like 6 or 7 years. And now we're finally going to make it in San Francisco Chinatown. So it felt like a little bit of a full circle, and it felt like the thing that I wanted back in 2018 probably wouldn't have been as interesting without those years of, wandering the desert.
So did you had made a film that got accepted to Sundance and then you couldn't really like push it forward? Like what happened to that?
Yeah. So, I made a short film and it got accepted into Sundance. And from there on, I think it was crazy because while you were there, you're in cohort with, I think, 70, 80 other shorts filmmakers just like you. And we are the little brothers to the people who are debuting, their actual films there, with the movie stars and that's the glitz and the glamour. And we're just there kind of like soft launching our careers, letting people know that we're around. And so a lot of agents and managers and producers come and knocking. They want to know what you're working on, what you got working on next. And so there's just like momentum and suddenly you're like in the showbiz, but you're just gonna kind of, I think for most of those people, especially a lot of them are from places like London, New York, and LA, like they already have this trajectory mapped out, like how a lot of kids took tennis lessons because they want to get into a really, really good school. And I felt like I was just playing tennis for the cardio and ended up in the same tournament as them, So I didn't know. I was just enjoying the parties and stuff. But I think everybody was pushing you like, this is when you're supposed to pitch. You're supposed to already have a couple of projects in your back pocket. They're lining you up with all these meetings. But I really was just showing up at the studios to like shake hands to be like, oh, wow, this is how the sausage is made. While I think everybody else, they already had some version of a film that I wanted to make pretty figured out. And what I made was a fun queer cowboy robbery short that was based on a real person that I read in Texas Monthly. And as I finished up with that, I feel like that was also the time where a lot of Asian filmmakers started to get their shot. And everyone was making Asian stories, and there was a lot of excitement around that. And I just remember thinking, like, I don't want to spend a year, 2 years doing a longer version of this short again, in the desert. And I love that story. I love the actors, but it's, like Asian people don't have to like prove their Americanness by doing like a white people's story anymore. That was like not the model anymore. At least that was a promise. I felt like we are still at the beginning of that stage 7 years later somehow. But the idea is like, we get to do our thing now. So that became a lot more exciting to me, but I just didn't have, it wasn't a smooth transition. It wasn't like the path that I accidentally carved for myself. I accidentally fell into and I became obsessed with an idea that would take me a couple more years to really like flesh out and understand like what I was trying to do with it. So, and I'm still at the beginning, we're not shooting until November. So yeah, so it felt like a very, very long detour, but it's fun.
Yeah. And you said that the detour, you go from Sundance to 2.5 years of doing a James Beard winning cookbook into returning again to film and directing, and yet you're returning in a different way.
Yeah, I think there is some embarrassment when at year 3 or 4 and you meet these people and they're like, what are you working on? And I was like, it's still the same movie, but I still haven't finished. I still don't really know what it is. It's a little bit embarrassing. It feels a little bit like, you got left behind or you are in remedial, it felt like a super senior in a way. But then at some point, people just forget that you make films. At some point, people are just like, oh, you're a cookbook photographer who is doing an exorcist movie in Chinatown. That's crazy. Like that became the story and that became how people saw you. So I just kind of went with it. So yeah, I think it also became proof of concept almost, where the photos that I took of aunties and things like that in Chinatown is a better proof of concept than in this short film that I made in the desert with white people. So it's funny to have a cookbook, using the cookbook as, your R&D and as your proof of concept for this very weird exotic thing that you're trying to do.
Yeah.
Pete, I'm curious about your eye and your ability to see depth in and kind of soul in things. That I've seen some of your photographs of food and then of Chinatown, and just it's obvious that you see something deeper in the ordinary. And where did that come from?
I don't know, because truth be told, I wasn't always like, I took photography in college. And I don't think I got good grades. And I think it took me actually a while to understand what light was. And I had a best friend in San Francisco who was a baker who became just one of the most famous cookbook photographers. His name is Eric Wolfinger. And he had this revelation, I think. I think he was a baker at this bakery called Tartine. And he shot the bread book, but he wasn't hired as a photographer. He was just hired to document the process. And what happened was, I think somebody came in and taught him this idea of like quality of light and directionality of light. And especially at this idea of like backlight, when you have things as backlit, it's a little bit sexier. I was always taught this idea, but when you're viewing everything on like a crappy video monitor and everything already looks crappy, it's kind of hard to understand what dramatic differences these like subtle changes provide. So it really took until, like I think year 1 or 2 of actually like owning the camera. So I was already way older than most people who just innately understood this kind of thing. But I don't know, it felt like once I got it, it just unlocked everything else. So I think a lot of how I saw stuff kind of came from that, just like suddenly understanding quality of light, like what the light is doing to my lens and how it is like hitting it and the different angles. So that became, and then, I start to get excited, where I start to get FOMO if I'm in a place and everything looks really good and I just don't have my camera by my side, so that became part of it. But I think the other part of it was just, hanging out with the right places with the right people. If you're in San Francisco in the last 15 years, you can really just get sidetracked with just all the companies and the new workers that kind of came in. But that wasn't, God bless their souls, but that wasn't the San Francisco that I moved there for. So I started seeking out, like you said, like kitchens and music studios and just street corners, just places that still reminded me of San Francisco. And that was just where it has people or stuff that was happening that was interesting to me. I just started hanging out there. So I think a lot of the stuff that I saw, I don't know if I saw it so much as like I was there. I knew that by spending time in this place, something's gonna happen. At the very least, when that 5 o'clock like sunset, that last ray of sun comes around and hits these things, it's gonna be pretty, even if nothing was happening. So I think that became like part of my process. Is just I don't know. It was so much development, and I don't think I was thinking with. I was taking photos with like my eyes. It was more with my feet and my bus pass. It was just being drawn to. Sometimes you hear about something and you just kind of want to hang out and ingratiate yourself with these people. And yeah, that became a lot of how these photos are taken. And again, just talking about technology, I also just think that nowadays, there's quality in the sensors, they're sensitive enough that even if the composition is a little bit off or whatever, like there's so many ways to fix that. So a lot of it's stuff that I learned in photo school about, rules of third and composition and that kind of stuff. They weren't as useful as like just having like the right face and the right light.
What's so interesting about your story, Pete, is you went into so many things without an agenda. You weren't one of those Sundance people who had like mapped out their trajectory and were kind of trying to vie toward it. You were just there enjoying it, right? And you were there in the restaurant just enjoying being a part of it. You were in Chinatown hanging out with the aunties, right? Like you're just kind of there and curious and doing things. And I'm just curious if you kind of think back to your 15-year-old self and this arc you've made in your life. Like, what do you think that 15-year-old self would make of this journey of yours so far?
I don't know. I mean, no job, no car, no girlfriend. I think my 15-year-old thought I was a loser. No, I have a job. But I do think my 15-year-old self was probably, I think when you have not as much like work to show for, then your identity becomes a lot more important. Like I have a lot of friends who are, they're in hospitality, they're servers, they're waiters, and they fantasize about this life of, becoming a model, an actor, a writer, or something like that. And sometimes you see them impulsively just quitting because there's this myth that if you quit and you devote, if you don't give yourself another option or whatever, then somehow that makes the thing that you want to do more inevitable. That just hasn't been the case. But I remember that feeling. I remember the first couple of years out of film school where I was just like a videographer at a nonprofit. I wasn't doing that much. I was also had to work as like a movie theater attendant. And I had this idea that I would shoot this short film with just a couple of my friends, and it'll be a thing that I could at least like have something to show for, and I get to call myself a director around that time. And it just ended up to be like really hard, I was trying to make a movie with like, I don't know, 12 people, but people have jobs and they move away, they go on vacation and that kind of thing. And just even logistically trying to do that, it became so hard. And then around that time too, I think there is a well-intentioned but kind of like misguided idea of purpose that I think some people have in evangelical circles that felt maybe less biblical, maybe more influenced by self-help stuff, but it was just as this thing that was very divine. And so I started questioning myself, is this my purpose? Anytime things didn't happen, I was just like, oh, this must not be my calling then. That was my calling. Am I defying my calling? Am I wasting everyone's time? And they just became like really heavy on, like a 22-year-old. And I just remember at some point, I just realized like, no, I think like who I am, as a filmmaker, as a whatever, I think that matters a lot less than whether or not like the work that I've made. Because like I didn't sign up for this thing to walk around and to be like it's for the status. There wasn't that much status. I signed up for this thing because like I wanted to make stuff with my friends, so the work became more important. And as time went on, as I had more work under my belt that I was proud of or that financially took care of me, it became easier to just go with the vibe. It became easier to have not an agenda because like the status of who I was or whatever, that just ceased to be a concern.
Right. I'm thinking about him being at Sundance, right? Where all his peers are like, okay, this is the jumping off moment. I have this plan. I'm going to pitch this. And he's just there enjoying the parties, enjoying the people. And then he goes back and has this, at the exact same time, this opportunity to shoot a cookbook, which he doesn't know is going to win a James Beard Award, right? It's just like he's committed this to a friend and he's going to pursue that and then takes 2.5 years to do it, right?
Yeah.
And just that trust in that pause, I kept thinking that would have been so hard for me to just release that drive for the director piece and to trust that it will come back around at the right time.
Yeah, there's kind of this interesting sort of moral courage that he displayed where it would have been the easier thing to choose the more prestigious director Sundance thing.
And drop his friend.
Mm-hmm. And instead, he knew he had promised his friend this thing and he kept to it and he,
and he doesn't half-ass it. He doesn't give it 6 months and then drop it, right?
Yeah.
2.5 years.
He committed. Yeah. And he had no idea what the outcome would be. I didn't even know books could become James
Beard Award
winners.
Yeah.
It's beautiful. And then the fact that through that process and through hanging out in Chinatown and just being a part of the ether there, that's what inspired this new full circle moment of him finally launching this movie. It's nice also to hear him talk about these different kinds of release moments for himself. I thought it was interesting that he was talking about what could have been perceived as a demotion.
Yes.
Was actually what he needed in that moment, right? And that as soon as he released himself from other people's perceptions of what he was doing and the level at which he was performing, it didn't matter.
Right.
And I think that's so helpful for so many of us, especially as we have to navigate more pivots in the future. Some of it might look lateral or even like a demotion.
Yeah.
And that's okay.
I know. And that there wasn't at all one trace of laziness, right? Or anything in that. There was always him following curiosity and real desire to immerse and learn something in that.